Hello, Susan.
Hi.
Haven't seen you in a while.
Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for coming today. And just as a little bit of background and why Allison and Susan are here is the editorial standards working group. Overall is just wrestling with ethical description, and particularly when you start categorizing people and putting them into buckets, and when it came to gender, there a certain amount of paralysis set in. And so I thought, well, it might be really great to hear from two scholars where, as problematic as gender is, that's where their scholarship is oriented, or a good portion of the scholarship oriented. And so they say it clearly as something to be wrestled with. So that's how Allison and Susan came into this discussion. And then we learned from them all kinds of really useful nuances. And I would say at this point, the paralysis has begun to subside. So over to you, Susan, and then we'll follow that with a brief open chat.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Daniel, and other members of SNAC who've organized this event. And I think I'm picking up very much where Allison left off. Can you see my slides at this point? I think I'm not projecting yet. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we see them perfectly.
Awesome, great. All right, so I'm joining you today from Guelph, which sits on the ancestral and treaty lands of several Indigenous peoples, including the Attawandaron people, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we honor them and our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors. We're on the eve of Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and so I want also to acknowledge the violence and dispossession, both historical and ongoing, that underlies the activism and protests of Indigenous groups and allies across Canada. My title, Always Already Provisional, is about the paradoxical way in which we can only really engage with categories of gender in relation to our current moment. So that's why I think I'm sort of picking up on what Allison is saying, like our terms will be obsolete. And there's a real humility to engaging in this kind of category work when you see what happens over time. So I'm starting from the position that there is no stance of objectivity around gender. It's always constructed, it's always embedded in particular times and places in ways that are paradoxically highly naturalized. So my thinking about gender comes out of three projects that I'll just describe briefly. The first is the Orlando Project, which is a history of women's writing in the British Isles from the beginnings to the present. And yeah, it's a history of women. We had to identify them in order to be able to talk about them. And we do also have lots of material on men and a few transgender people. So we had to, call them out in the interface. So that's a project that's been going since the mid-90s. And we're gonna have a new interface. Looks really dated right now. I'm very excited. I'll be showing you a tiny glimpse of that. And that's the homepage of it. Then that led to a sort of infrastructure project to try to share what Orlando had developed in terms of a production environment for doing sophisticated text markup using XML. And so that's a project called the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory, which is a mouthful. So we just pronounced the acronym CWRC, QUIRC. So if I say QUIRC, I am talking about that. And then finally, we've been sort of thinking as we struggled over the years about like, how could we connect up to all this other fabulous work on women's writing, like collective biographies of women, or the Women Writers Project at Northeastern, many other resources. And linked data really seems to be, despite its complications and difficulties, the best hope for that. So I'm now in the midst of working with colleagues to build an infrastructure for working with humanities data using linked open data technologies. So that's the context. All of this involves category work, and it's sort of increasingly structured category work as you move from Orlando through Cork to Lynx. This, of course, category work cuts across many fields. It's really crucial, as I said, to recovery work and thinking about women's writing in history. But that project, Orlando, started in the middle of the essentialism debates in the 1990s. So it felt very vexed. We used to joke that we should call it a history of those who have been called women, just to make it clear that we were not being essentialist. And increasingly, I think now we're becoming aware of, as data has gotten bigger, as classificatory systems have moved into our lived infrastructures, that these digital systems of representation have real world impacts. And that's, I think, where Daniel was coming from and talking about, the sort of paralysis that can set in. We know it matters, and we know it matters a lot. We don't want to do the wrong thing. And furthermore, we have people like Eve Sedgwick, articulating in no uncertain terms that this, categorization and classification and authorities can't do it all. Like, there has to be other ways of talking about these things and representing these things that go along with them. And indeed, in the case of Sedgwick, there can be, a pretty thoroughgoing critique of these practices. They are necessary and inescapable, and as Bowker and Starr say, dangerous. So we have to try and do better. There's a clear mandate for that. I think Miriam Posner puts it brilliantly in this blog post. Given the shortcomings of legacy systems and the ways that gender have been categorized in the past, we thought long and hard about how we can, try to move forward with this, given all of the difficulties of doing so. So within Orlando, we spent quite a long time thinking about the knowledge representation around what we called eventually cultural formation, the process of identity formation, and the sort of complex relationship between individual understandings of people by themselves and social categorization. And so what we came up with was quite a complex system using XML, both to sort of provide big bucket tags that would give context and label a context as having to do with religion, ethnicity, social class, sexuality, and also granular tags that would provide, if you like, the labels, but they wouldn't be constrained in any way. So no authorities. Essentially, we said, well, we'll do it for class, but we're not going to do it for anything else, too complicated. Except we did actually do it for sex, which we put somewhere else entirely, not within cultural formation, because it was sort of foundational. So we were categorizing everybody at the root level of a document according to their sex. And eventually we became really uncomfortable with that for a whole range of reasons. It was inconsistent. We, shifted very much towards thinking about the fact that we don't actually know about the sex of the writers we're talking about. We really only know about their gender. We don't know what their genitalia were like. So we have to just talk about how they were operating in terms of their gender. And so we've been in a process of reform to try and fix that confusion between sex and gender, and alongside that, creating a ontology for the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we ended up coming up with a strategy that sort of moved gender into the cultural formation tags, which gave us all of that apparatus that we already had in the way that the knowledge representation worked around discursivity, providing context, providing the ability to provide multiple labels for the same thing, for the same person at different points in their life, and so on, and being able to indicate whether something was self-identified or not. And I do think, the way presumed works in collective biographies of women operates very much the same way. So we went from a kind of binary, which later became a tripart labeling of sex, to talking about gender and these 6 categories that you see here for man, woman, trans, unknown, non-binary, and non-conforming. And where that leads us to is not just markup, but of course, interface. How do we present that to users and provide affordances in the way that people are interacting with the data? So this is what the faceting of search results looks like in the new interface. So you can restrict a search to just persons, and then you can restrict to one of these terms if they appear in the search results. So you don't get the entire list of genders, only the ones that apply in a particular case. And so this is what it looks like in practice here on the bottom left. If you do a search for Jan, you get Jan Morris, and you'll see that in that set of 441 results, there are 61 women and 1 trans person. You're probably aware of the controversy with J.K. Rowling and so on around what counts as a woman. And we thought about this quite carefully and basically decided we didn't want to make trans folks invisible, but that what we would do is, whoops, it looks like I lost my slide that shows that. I think I had a duplicate and must have removed the duplicate in the one I was trying to go to. But if you click on trans here, you would just get Jan Morris. If you click on woman here, trans will obviously not be showing anymore, but Jan Morris will still be there. She'll still be represented as she with the gender that she selected, as well as the fact that she was trans. So, or that she self-identified as, not selected. So all of this is then feeding into this ontology that I mentioned that Quark is creating, because it is a platform that generates linked data from its metadata and also from XML content in the form of the kind of markup that I've been talking about. So we tried to translate this into a linked data context, but of course we have to get a whole lot more precise about the terms. Strings won't work anymore. You have to, within an ontology, have things. And so this is the definition for gender, discursive, related to other terms in the ontology, and so on. So this is moving well away from the sort of thing that Eve Sedgwick was arguing for, but to our mind, it's worth taking the risk of creating these definitions, which will not necessarily please everybody. I'm sure they won't please everybody, and basically taking a stance on it as a way of thinking about gender at the given moment, and doing that in order to allow data sets to be linked up to each other within the Quark platform, which has quite a number of projects on women's writing. And so this becomes a way of providing common vocabulary for bringing them together. And I know this community needs no preaching on that score. So how does this work in practice when it comes to all those legacy terms that are everywhere in the data that we might want to be linking up to? Because of course, it's, as you know, very, very costly to have to go back and revise data sets. There's a lot out there that we would want to link to that are using older terms. So this very elaborate diagram is showing how we relate our gender terms, so man and woman in the top and bottom left, and other terms in the middle, to the old terms for sex, which are still very widely used from the ISO 5218 standard of man, woman, unknown, and other, I think they are. So 1 and 2 are man and woman. And you can see the green boxes connected to something called man label and woman label. So what we do here is we basically stress that there's a representationality to gender. And so we have this notion of a category of thing, an entity within our ontology that is a label that can pull together different terms that sort of go by that label. So our term for man goes by that label. And then there's this other kind of relationship then represents called has functional relation between our label term and the ISO categories. And that's because this is not just another label for another gender that's going by a different name. This is actually something different. Gender is not sex. They're not the same thing. We don't want to assert a semantic or meaningful relationship between them, but we want to say is there's a functional relationship between them. So for certain purposes like display or search or grouping, you might want, or for harvesting data, you might want to draw on that functional relationship between these terms, but we are not condoning a kind of conflation of them in any semantic sense. So that's a, you know, a way of trying to articulate the messiness and complexity of how you try and essentially crosswalk between legacy terms that may have pretty negative impacts within, you know, a contemporary context, but that you nevertheless are finding in the data and want to link up to your own data. So that's the sort of basic strategy as far as it goes for gender. And I'm very happy to talk about this in more detail because I realize I'm going through it quite quickly. But it also operates, we use this exactly the same kind of strategy when it comes to other kinds of cultural identities. So ethnicity, race, nationality, religion, and so on. We can use that same strategy, which you see here for Jewishness, where you can have a label for the term Jewish, which occurs across all sorts of data sets. You may not know what it means in a particular context. So say you're doing named entity recognition, trying to pull data out of a big collection of texts or something like that, you may end up with things that you can only say are labels. But in the case of the Orlando data, we can be more precise and say, okay, this is Jewishness as religion, this is Jewishness as ethnicity, this is Jewishness as nationality, or as, you know, being treated as race or color. All of these contexts are sort of applied to terms that get covered by this label, and then they can be represented, they can be linked to particular authors in terms of those contexts. So we have predicates specifically for saying that somebody has an ethnicity or nationality and so on. So it's a way of trying to keep a kind of precision in our data where we have it about what we're talking about, whether somebody's self-identified as something or whether we're putting a label on them. We can say all those things with our markup, but we also have more generalized ways of getting from that specificity out to something that we would be comfortable saying, okay, that's an equivalent to the way that Jewish is used in some other data set where they may have treated the concept quite differently. But because by the time we're talking about labels, we're talking about representationality, we're comfortable with that kind of equivalency in a way we wouldn't be if we were asserting a semantic crosswalking or equivalency. So that's really, in a nutshell, the strategy that we've adopted in the Orlando project to the whole vexed problem of the kind of world making that is involved in categorizing and classification. It's really important, and it's also very, very troubling, and I think rightly so, because we recognize the ways in which these things have power. So all of this is laid out more fully in an article in PMLA that Allison edited with Miriam Posner, and it's a fantastic set of essays. But I'm not calling, there's many more better ones than mine there. But if you wanted to follow up on the argument, that's where you could find it. And yeah, thanks again for having me here and for letting me share this with you.
Thank you very much, Susan.